Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
Very small piece of follow-up from last episode. A friend who grew up in Eastern Europe very gently corrected me after the show was published that I had incorrectly pronounced the name of the founder of Akrivia as Rexepi. It turns out it would be pronounced, and I'm probably going to butcher this as well if you speak Albanian, but I was told it's Regepi. So my apologies, Recep. I stand corrected.
Better you than me. I can't pronounce people's names to save my life, so I'm as people have already commented on with some of my horrible pronunciations.
Yeah, well, an X followed by an H isn't something you're going to find very frequently, if at all, in the English language.
Early on, when we started discussing this podcast, we created a shared document of topics that we wanted to cover. One of the topics that both of us had put on the list that we hadn't gotten around to was magic. I think both you and I have been fascinated with magic to some degree or another, and as we'll discuss, there are a lot of crossovers between magic and watchmaking. This week seems like a good week to talk about it. And unfortunately, over the weekend, one of the greats of the magic world, Ricky Jay, passed away. And so we thought we'd take this opportunity to talk a little bit about Ricky Jay, including a few really, really good videos of his and a good article about him. And also talk a little bit about some of the other magicians who have had influences with the watch world and sort of the mechanical world, and discuss a little bit about that and why it is that we are fascinated with magic.
So do you recall the first time you saw Ricky Jay perform?
I don't know that I recall the first time I saw him do magic as a magic thing, like as a presentation of magic. I think the first time I ever saw Ricky Jay would have probably been a TV show or a movie. One of the things that Ricky did to make money through his life was act as a consultant for Hollywood. And he helped train actors to perform magic tricks in TV shows and movies. He also worked on some of the illusions for movies and TV shows and making those illusions work properly. And then on top of that, he himself showed up in a number of TV shows and movies. I know one of my favorite examples of him in a TV show or movie was in the HBO TV show Deadwood. He shows up as one of the hustlers who's running a gambling house in Deadwood. Of course, he puts his card handling skills to use in the show, not necessarily to as magic, but as a way of hustling the patrons of the gambling house. So I don't know the first time that I ever saw him sort of do a magic bit. Most of it was him showing up as sort of a character actor in TV shows and movies. Now, when I brought it up, his passing over the weekend, I'd sent you a few things. Had you run into Ricky Jay before? Like, had you ever come across him?
In various capacities, yes. I would say, looking back now, in retrospect, I was oblivious to the fact that it was Ricky Jay I had encountered. I read one of his books entitled "Cards as Weapons" when I was in my youth. That is how I learned to throw cards. So I learned to throw cards from Ricky Jay without knowing it was Ricky Jay who taught me, or at least not having a face to put to the name, because his name was obviously on the book, but it's not something that I retained. And it wasn't until much later in life that I realized that it was him who had written the book. I would say Ricky Jay was not a household name for me growing up. I came of age in the era of David Blaine, and by comparison, they're two very different artists. And if I were to compare their sleight of hand, I'd say Ricky Jay's, to me, in my opinion, is superior, simply because I've been able to replicate essentially every trick sleight of hand trick I've seen David Blaine do over the years. But I am still flabbergasted by a number of the things that Ricky Jay can do. And while I can catch the occasional sleight, I'm just absolutely clueless sometimes as to how he pulls off what he does. It's absolutely incredible. His skill as a card handler.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that makes him stand out from other artists like a David Blaine, somebody like a Ricky Jay. He's often sort of the man behind the curtain who's discovering the ways of doing things and the ways of tricking people. So, for instance, if you remember The Illusionist and The Prestige, there are a number of magic bits in there that originally people thought were just movie magic, like people were using film techniques or camera tricks to be able to do them. But in fact, they were actually Ricky Jay's tricks, and they were real tricks that he was, that he had taught them to do on screen. So, yeah, there's a big difference between somebody who's a performer versus somebody who's an actual magician. And Ricky Jay is one of those sort of magicians. He really did know his stuff. And as you say, his sleight of hand work is unbelievable.
I would say sleight of hand is hands down my favorite flavor of magic. I'll take in a show of Grand Illusions just for kicks, but it doesn't hold the same wow factor for me as the sheer magnitude of skill from years of distilled practice that unfolds in a matter of moments with nothing more than a few coins or a deck of cards in the hands of a master like Ricky Jay, or Ricky Jay's mentor Di Vernon, and folks like that, or Slidini even. Seeing old clips of Slidini is it's unreal. He just makes cards appear out of nowhere.
I grew up in an era when, previous to David Blaine, it was David Copperfield. I remember as a kid gathering around and watching some of the David Copperfield specials. And one of the things that's always disappointed me is knowing how the David Copperfield effects were done and seeing just how much of it was being done through camera tricks, and things like that. So it was very easy to sort of see you weren't being tricked necessarily through great skill, but through some kind of an obvious illusion. One of the things that's interesting when you watch somebody like a Ricky Jay work, or as you mentioned, Di Vernon, somebody like that, even when you know what he's doing and you know the move that he's about to make, you'd still never see the move that he makes. You never see what he's done. He's just so good at hiding what he's doing, and he is so clean at his manipulations that you just can't follow it. And that's always impressed me. And it takes an incredible amount of skill and devotion to doing that. Mm-hmm. I know that most of his life he spent 10 or 12 hours a day, every day, practicing with a deck of cards and practicing those manipulations. And that's something that you just don't get through the big flashy magicians. They just don't practice to that degree because they're relying on other ways of sort of fooling people.
Yeah, their props are literally propping them up.
Exactly.
Like that, their skill is so heavily invested in the props and everything that is happening behind them. Whereas, there are gimmicks that exist, but it is almost entirely within the hands and the skill of the performer.
Right. You could hand somebody like Ricky Jay a deck of cards, and he could do things that you gave him, that you controlled, that you knew were clean cards, and he could do things that would blow your mind. And that's something that these sort of stage magicians often can't do. That's not what they need their props to be able to pull off their illusions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a great example of this for me is that I was out for dinner one evening with some friends, and a friend of a friend was there. And he's a drummer, and he's played for a number of bands over the years, usually filling in. So big names like Shania Twain and whatnot, he would be the backup drummer for. And we're sitting there at the table, and it's taking forever for the food to arrive. And he grabs 2 utensils and he starts fiddling with them. And all of a sudden he's drumming out this beat on random plates and glasses that he sort of pulled a note out of just by experimenting with them. And he was able to just riff there on the table with like riff-raff. Meanwhile, you can give someone with very little experience on the drums the best set of drums in the world, and they're still going to sound like garbage. Whereas you give someone with the talent and the skill to play the drums a coffee can and some chopsticks, and they're going to be able to hammer out a beat.
Absolutely. There's a really great scene at the opening of the documentary called It Might Get Loud, which is a sort of an exploration of music with Jimmy Page, Jack White, and The Edge from U2. And this documentary opens with Jack White taking some found objects, including a board and a few nails and a guitar string and a pop bottle, and he's got a single string and a pickup for an electric guitar. And in the course of about a minute, he sits there and builds this one string slide guitar, and then ends up playing, something incredible with it, right? And that's the kind of thing that you see with a master of an art, right? It doesn't really matter what it is that they have. It doesn't they don't need a Stradivari violin to be able to play incredible music. They just need to have something that will make the noise that they need to play on. Again, you take this the example of a master card manipulator, and you give them a set of cards, and it doesn't matter that they've never seen that deck of cards before. They can still do incredible things with it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So just after the news of Ricky Jay's passing, you sent along a documentary that I had not seen before called Deceptive Practice. It just sort of takes a look at a lot of his mentors over the years and how he came to learn and master what he did. An interesting tidbit that I pulled from that I was not aware of is that Di Vernon was actually Canadian, and not just Canadian, but was born right here in Ottawa, where we are recording tonight.
The full name of that documentary is Deceptive Practice: The Mysteries and Mentors of Ricky Jay. And I think that the mentors part of that is extremely important, because he does focus a lot on the master magicians that he was able to learn from. Di Vernon is probably the most significant of those. And as you say, he was born here in Ottawa, although I can't imagine. He was born in 1894 in Ottawa. And Ottawa's not really a thriving metropolis now. It's it's still a pretty small city, but 1894, Ottawa wouldn't have been very far removed from being the logging town that it started as. So I can't imagine that it would have been an exciting place to live in 1894.
Well, you can understand why he wanted to relocate to LA.
That's very true.
Yeah, so Di Vernon ended up spending quite a bit of his life and career in and around the Magic Castle in Los Angeles, and actually attracted quite an array of talent to migrate there, including Ricky Jay. And he taught and passed on much of his knowledge in bits and pieces here and there. You were lucky if you got past a little scrap of what he had hidden in his vast inventory of skills and tricks. But he certainly was a treasure in the magic community, and one of the greatest sleight of hand artists to have ever lived.
We've talked a lot on this show about passing knowledge on and sharing knowledge, and how, as I've mentioned before, one of my favorite quotes from Philippe Dufour is "Graveyards are full of secrets." And famously, magic is very secretive. There's extreme penalties in the community if you reveal your secrets or other people's secrets. It's sort of unfortunate in some ways. I know one point in the documentary, or was it in the rock documentary? There's, unfortunately, I read a great that great New Yorker piece about Ricky Jay and watched Deceptive Practice, all within about 2 hours of each other. So I confusing various quotes from each source. But at one point, Ricky Jay mentions how it's unfortunate that the sleight of hand artists that are coming up now have never seen Di Vernon perform in person.
Mm-hmm.
And we are now going to be able to say the same thing about Ricky Jay. There, even though there's video footage of him performing, unfortunately, there are people who will never get a chance to see him perform, who will go on to become some of the great sleight of hand artists. And I have to wonder how much of what he knew is now lost because, they are so secretive about what happens in the effects that they're using. Because I'm pretty sure there are probably effects that he learned. I know there's one that he sort of coyly talks about in the documentary that he learned from Di Vernon. And, he quickly says, and no, I won't tell you what it is. I wonder if he's ever told anybody what that is and if he's ever passed that on. And it's sort of unfortunate if that's happened.
Yeah, that line was indeed in the documentary. A parallel to that I found interesting, which is in the article that you sent me, was the anecdote about a young magician coming up to him and basically lavishing him with praise and telling him about how he did so many of Ricky Jay's tricks, and Ricky Jay essentially paralleled it to him coming into his house and stealing his TV, because he's stealing his work rather than taking the core concepts and building off it. Now, I'm sure there is a lot of knowledge that has passed away with Ricky Jay, but at the same time, he has amassed a treasure trove of literature. And if anyone wanted to learn and know, I would say, a good volume of what Ricky Jay knows, they could digest his library the same way that he did over the course of his life, because he has a lot of rare and obscure literature, and a lot of his tricks were founded in very old and forgotten tomes of magic.
You're right. There is obviously the ability to go back into old books and find a lot of this information. But then at the same time, as we know, some of those books become difficult to find just because they get sucked up by collectors and sort of hidden away, and they're no longer available, especially in the magic world where people don't want that information being shared out there. Tamara did bring up an interesting point the other day. One of the anecdotes that comes up in the article about Ricky Jay is the dissemination of an extremely important collection of magic books that he was curator of at one point. David Copperfield ends up getting the collection at auction. Ricky Jay is not particularly happy about it for various reasons that are worth reading in the article, but I won't go into. As Tamara brought up, she wonders what's going to end up with his collection. And I can pretty much guarantee you that David Copperfield will not end up with that collection. I suspect if there is some sort of provision that it either goes to a specific person or it's only available for certain people to be able to acquire. I can't imagine that he would want it to be acquired by David Copperfield after that incident. I know that artifice, ruse, and subterfuge at the card table was one of his primary sources early on in his life about card magic, because that was a book that was written in the 19th century by card hustlers, not magicians, but men who were trying to hustle money out of other men at a card table. And for them, screwing up a trick wasn't just you saw what I did and you now know the trick. It often had serious consequences for them. He learned a lot of what he used in his life from that. And of course, a huge amount of what he was able to do and show off came from the fact that he practiced hours and hours every day for most of his life. I think he was saying that the earliest magic show he gave was when he was 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he died at the age of 72. So at the very least, he had been working as a magician for 68 years. And I think if any of us ended up practicing anything for 10% of the time that Ricky Jay did, we'd probably be considered masters at it.
Yes, it sounds impossible, but from everything that I've seen of his skill and from things that I've heard, Ricky Jay was capable of shuffling a deck and keeping track of the position of every single card in that deck. So at any given point in time, he knew exactly where to find a card. If you were to say count down through the cards, what have you, but knowing the order of the cards in the deck as he was shuffling it so that he could bend the deck to his will to reveal a given card at a given point as he wished. And to pull something like that off, you need to be practicing at that level with that number of hours in a day. And like I said, it sounds impossible, but I've seen tricks that he's done where he very much is shuffling and manipulating the cards, and boom, is able to lay them out in perfect order.
It is remarkable the way that he's able to shuffle, and of course, I understand that some of that is fake shuffling, some of it's a false shuffle. However, seeing some of that, it isn't a false shuffle, and he is actually keeping track of those cards and manipulating the deck so that he knows exactly where each card is. And it's amazing seeing some of his sort of practice routines and watching what he does, along with Deceptive Practice being an excellent documentary of his life. There are also some amusing sort of performances in there, and on top of that, there's a couple of other videos that we'll link to, some older videos that show more of his performance. Ricky Jay and his 52 Assistants was a show that he did back in the 90s, I believe it was, that was filmed, and it was sort of an hour-long special, I think, that was done for HBO, and that was excellent. And you see more of his routine, and you see more of his pattern, how he performs, and you see him performing some classics like the Cup and Balls, and that is it's a remarkable thing to see him do. Some of the work that he does, everything from manipulation to memorization. His ability to remember things was remarkable, and so that it's an interesting look at some of what he was able to do, and sort of see him in his prime showing off some of those skills.
Do you practice any sort of sleight of hand at all?
I do every once in a while, and I over the years I've learned a fair bit about sleight of hand magic because just like you, I find it fascinating. I love knowing what's going on. For instance, when I watch something like the Cup and Balls, I know how the Cup and Balls works, and I know how to watch the Cup and Balls routine and watch the things that the magician doesn't want you watching. Some people don't like knowing how a trick is done. I find it fascinating because when you find someone who really knows how to do the Cup and Balls, you get an even higher appreciation of what it is that they're doing, because you know what they're doing and you still can't see what they're doing. So I've practiced with things like the Cup and Balls routine. I've practiced a couple of coin sleights. I've practiced a little bit of card manipulation, but I've never spent the time to, sort of dedicated the time to do it well, because I have too many other things that I want to be able to get good at. And so unfortunately that I've just never been very good at these. But I do understand a fair number of concepts of magic, and I do enjoy watching great magic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really does take practice to stay sharp. I would say I would be more confident, or would have been more confident 10 years ago performing for someone than now. Right at this stage of my life, I'll bust out a little trick impromptu here and there just for fun, but I would not be able to sustain that for 20 minutes or half hour at a dinner party like I could have a decade ago.
Yeah, and I think that somebody to get really good at magic, you really have to pick it up at the right time in your life, where you have the time to be able to spend hours a day working on it. And whether that's because you are young and you just have free time to be able to do that kind of thing, or you happen to be stuck in a job that allows you to do that kind of thing, or whatever it is. I've known coworkers who will sit there on the phone, and all they do for 8 hours a day while they're on the phone is manipulate cards, and you watch them doing that, and that's how they practice. But I think unless you have the time to dedicate to that kind of thing, you're never going to get to the kind of skill level that these guys are getting to.
Yeah, my hands tend to be otherwise occupied when I'm working.
And that's one of the problems that I have too. I'm either working on a computer and building stuff on a computer, or I am making things with my hands in the shop. And so, manipulating a deck of cards while you're trying to operate a lathe is not advised.
So have you read the Artificers and Subterfuge at the card table?
I flipped through it. I haven't had a chance to read it in depth, and it's something I've meant to read a little bit more critically than I have in the past. Yeah, I need to read through it a little bit better and sort of get a better understanding of what it is that they're doing and how they're doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not a book that I've ever picked up, but from what I gleaned from the documentary, that was Di Vernon's textbook as well. Growing up, that's what the foundation of his skill as a sleight of hand artist. Another small quote, which I'd say I'm paraphrasing because I didn't take notes while watching the documentary. But there's this anecdote about Di sitting there on a bench outside of the Magic Castle, just watching people put on their sport coats and noticing the subtle differences between them all. And I think it was something along the lines of him relaying to Ricky that much of sleight of hand is the duplication of natural action. So taking a natural action, making it seem natural while subtly hiding the actual action you're performing. I think sums up quite well the art of sleight of hand. Your hands are doing something. They appear to be doing something when in reality they are doing something very different.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great anecdote from the documentary and what it taught Ricky about how to deceive people. I think one of the other things that I love about the way he looked at it, because he approached learning this early on from books that were designed to deceive people for taking their money. Right? Again, they're these hustlers, and who are making money off of this. And one of the things that I've always admired about a number of magicians is that they, even though they know that a lot of what they're doing is rooted in that deception and in that, being a hustler and a hoaxer, they approach magic from a different point of view. They're using those same skills, but they're telling people, I'm here to fool you. I'm not getting anything out of you other than your amazement that I've done something. They're not trying to trick you to take your money or to steal your watch or something like that, even though they could easily.
And sometimes do.
And sometimes do, yes. Some magicians do that. One of my favorite lines from this is when he says, magic is inherently honest. And even though they're deceiving you, it is inherently honest because they're telling you that they're going to deceive you. They're telling you exactly what they're going to do to you. They're going to fool you into believing that something has happened that hasn't happened. And I like that idea that through deception, magic is an inherently honest thing that they're showing you. And there are a number of magicians that I admire, people like Penn and Teller, people like Eric Mead. They've all been very upfront about that. They believe that you shouldn't be using this to con people, but instead to amaze them.
Yeah, amaze and delight. So do you own any gimmicks, which is the technical term for a magic trick or a prop, something that is not as it seems, that allows you to do something that is not as it seems?
No, I've intentionally never learned a trick that requires a gimmick. And I've always felt that if I was going to learn something, if I was going to learn a trick, that it should be something that I could do with any version of the object that I'm working on. So for instance, if I'm doing the cup and balls routine, I have a set of cups and balls that I've practiced with and that I'm more familiar with, but the techniques that I'm using should work with conceivably any cup that's the same sort of size and any ball that's the same sort of size that I'm used to. Same thing with card tricks or a coin manipulation. I've always felt that if I'm going to learn a card trick, I should be able to do it with any deck of cards that's been given to me. I've never practiced with things like marked cards. Marked cards are very easy to use once you know what you're doing with them. But the problem with that is that you're then relying on your marked cards to do the trick. I certainly don't blame people who do use some sort of a gimmick for being able to perform magic, because frankly, it does open up a whole other world of possibilities in terms of what you can do. But I know for myself, I've always felt that that's not the way I would want to approach it.
I briefly just defined what a gimmick was there. For people who've been tracking with us this far, they've probably caught on by now, but just in case, how would you define sleights or sleight of hand as a term?
I think any kind of sleight of hand or manipulation is the act of taking an object with your hands and doing something with it that's unexpected. So for instance, in a simple case, you might take a coin in one hand and pretend to pass it to the other, but instead of passing it to the other hand, you've retained it in your first hand. So you've got a coin in your right hand, you pretend to pass it to your left hand, but you haven't actually done it. Or, the classic one that you see people do with kids where you pull a coin from their ear, right? And so obviously the coin doesn't actually come from the kid's ear. It's come from their hand, but it's a situation where you have, it's a situation where you have that coin in your hand, you've hidden it, and you're then manipulating it to appear in your hand and as if it's coming out of the ear. So that's how I define sleight of hand. And it can be used for any number of different things with any number of different objects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it shares a root word with sly. So that's a cunningness and skill.
And when it's come to magicians and magic that's being performed, nearly all of my favorite magicians are sleight of hand artists. So people like Ricky Jay. Another one of my favorites is Eric Mead as a modern performer. And again, he's another sort of magician's magician. If you were to query some of the top magicians that you've heard of in the world and you say, who are the top sleight of hand artists in the world, Ricky Jay's name would of course come up in that. He was certainly one of those people, but Eric Mead is somebody whose name would pop up at the top of that list quite consistently. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of videos of the work that he's done. Probably the best video I've seen of Eric Mead performing was on Penn and Teller's Fool Us last season, and he shows off a trick that he's modified slightly from another magician who unfortunately had passed away, and it's done with coins and a leather tube that had open ends on both ends. And watching him perform again, if you know the trick that he's doing, you can see a lot of what's going on. But there are a few things in there that he's doing that are just remarkable. Watching him perform that it's a joy to watch. Even watching it over and over again on video, it's very, very difficult to see what he's doing, even when that he's doing something and what it is that he's doing. So yeah, that we'll put a link to that video in the show notes. It's worth watching because it's amusing. If you've never seen Penn and Teller Fool Us, it's an interesting idea for a show because you have two magicians, Penn and Teller, who are well known. Penn obviously being the loud one who's more of the performer, and Teller who is again one of the top magicians in the world. He is really, again, he's a magician's magician. And one of the things that I always enjoy about watching that clip is watching Teller's face as Eric Mead performs the trick, because Teller knows the trick. He knows exactly what the trick is supposed to be, except for the little twist that Eric puts in it. Even being a master magician at sleight of hand himself, he's unable to tell what it is that Eric Mead is doing. I always enjoy watching that kind of thing. And again, if you can see someone performing for another master magician and fooling them like that, it is really remarkable. And it's, as I said, it's a joy to watch Teller watching that particular display.
And really, so much of it does come down to presentation and storytelling as well, which is, I think, in his own unique way, Ricky Jay was very good at. One of his funnier bits is the Four Queens, which I had fun doing a trick with a somewhat similar storyline when I was like 8 years old, and it involved a lot of math to pull it off with the cards. But I had my whole little story, and it was entertaining for people. But it doesn't hold a candle to to Ricky Jay's Four Queens, which is a very impressive close-up magic trick that he performs.
That's always one of my favorite tricks from Ricky Jay. There are a number of great stories that he does tell, and it's of course, when you watch some of these videos, you can see these artists performing the same trick a couple of different times, and you can hear their pattern, you can hear the way that they've maybe modified it slightly over the years, but you sort of get a sense of familiarity every time you watch it. And that's one I've seen a few different versions of that, and it's quite good. I think something we'll end up talking a little bit more about in a future episode is how magic ties in with some of the world of automata and magic clocks and things like that, because I think that deserves a little bit more depth than what we could do tonight. There's certainly a huge crossover between the world of magic and the world of mechanical making, just because a lot of these tricks, a lot of these illusions are reliant upon sort of clockwork mechanisms. But there's a long history of a crossover between the two worlds.
Absolutely, particularly with the early magic, because so much of magic is, well, there's a lot of the sleight of hand type stuff, but a lot of illusions and things like that are based and founded in cutting edge fringe technologies that the general populace is just not aware of or doesn't believe can exist. And as we alluded to in one of our earliest episodes, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And in a lot of ways, clockwork mechanisms and whatnot 200 years ago was indistinguishable from magic. And to riff off you a little bit from those early episodes, I think a lot of what Ricky Jay was able to achieve is pulling up sufficiently ancient tricks that and mastering them to such effect that it blows the minds of modern day magicians.
And I think the other half of that's impossible to discount is the amount of work that these master magicians are willing to put in to make an effect work. And that's something I know the Teller has talked about in when he's discussed some of his work, and he's had people who've told him, they're like, oh, well, this is the only way I can think of doing that, but that's ridiculous. The amount of work that would be involved in doing that or doing it that way is just, it's preposterous. And that's exactly what they rely on. They rely on the idea that you don't realize to what lengths they are willing to go to fool you and manipulate you. And that in some cases means practicing for years. I know Teller has talked about the fact that they've had tricks in development for 10 or 11 years that have never made it into their show because they're not ready yet. And most people can't even fathom the idea of practicing something for 10 or 11 years without a payoff like that. Between the two things, between the sufficiently ancient techniques in this case and the desire to put in an astronomical amount of time to perfect it, that those two things are what allow these magicians to fool you and be able to do what they do.
So for anyone who might not have been familiar with Ricky Jay's legacy prior to this, where would you recommend they start?
I think the two things you need to start with is the New Yorker article about him. I believe it's Ricky Jay's Magical Secrets. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's a long article, and it's going to take you a couple of minutes to read, but it is worthwhile. And it is really the blueprint for Deceptive Practice, the documentary that was published a few years ago about him. And that's something that I'd recommend going through after you've read the New Yorker article, because then you sort of have an idea of where the story is going, but you get to see the visuals of it. You get to see what he's doing, and that's worthwhile. And if you enjoyed that, then we'll put some links to a few other things like Ricky Jay and his 52 assistants into the show notes, and you can watch that and enjoy it. But certainly, at the very least, I'd recommend reading the New Yorker article and watching Deceptive Practice.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @OffHours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.
I just found a story that I always love about him. Deborah Barron, a screenwriter in Los Angeles, where Jay lives, once invited him to a New Year's Eve dinner party at her home. About a dozen other people attended. Well past midnight, everyone gathered around a coffee table as Jay, at Barron's request, did close-up card magic. When he had performed several dazzling illusions and seemed ready to retire, a guest named Mort said, "Come on, Ricky, why don't you show us something truly amazing?" Barron recalls that at that moment, the look in Ricky's eyes was like, "Mort, you have just fucked with the wrong person." Jay told Mort to name a card, any card. Mort said the 3 of hearts. After shuffling, Jay gripped the deck in the palm of his right hand and sprung it, cascading all 52 cards so they traveled the length of the table and pelted an open wine bottle. "Okay, Mort, what was your card again?" "The 3 of hearts. Look inside the bottle." Mort discovered curled inside the neck the 3 of hearts. The party broke up immediately.
Yeah, it's from the New Yorker article.
Yeah. I've always loved that story because you can get the sense that that's exactly the kind of person that he was, right? Like it was just one of those, I'm willing to amuse you and I'm willing to sort of play to the crowd, but then if you screw with me, I'm going to make sure you regret it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you'd have to be there. And same for the $2 or 2 $1 bills into the $2 bill.
Oh, when he's in the shower. The fact that he was able to pull that off in the shower is remarkable because the planning and forethought into, that must have been put into that is
showering with a false thumb.
But again, that's an example of the level of effort that somebody's willing to go to pull that kind of thing off, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a neat thing too from the documentary. There's like Ricky Jay being able to go to these guys' houses when he's like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and have like one-on-one performances with these masters.
Oh yeah, you have to imagine that if after being exposed to some of those people as a child, if he hadn't become a world-class magician, you have to wonder what the heck was going on, and I think you have to imagine that anybody who was exposed to that level of skill in any art would just pick it up enough of it to be quite gifted as it was.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that would have been remarkable, getting access to that. And of course, you see people who do go on to become magicians, world-class magicians, and in some cases, all they needed was to be exposed to an uncle who was an amateur magician and taught them some basic stuff when they were 7 years old or whatever. And that's enough to sort of slingshot them into it. So I can't imagine having some of the top magicians in the world, sort of at your beck and call and teaching you how to do amazing sleight of hand. I can't even imagine how effective that would be. Now, one of the other things I haven't seen yet, and I heard about it a couple of years ago, and I had forgotten to look into it. It was a documentary called Dealt. I don't know if you've heard of this at
card, all.
Yeah, the guy's blind. His name's Rick Turner, I think it is.
Okay.
He's completely blind, and he's able to do incredible card manipulation.
Wow. Does he have a braille deck?
No.
Interesting.
He showed up on Fool Us. That's how I first came across him.
Now, in the vein of being blind, have you ever noticed the hidden 8 on the 8 of diamonds?
I did, yes.
I just saw that recently for the very first time.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, that's something that somebody pointed out to me years ago. And I mean, I didn't notice it on my own. Somebody did actually point it out to me. But yeah, that's one of those things that until you see it, you never see it.
It's the FedEx arrow in a deck of playing cards.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's one of those ones that's kind of amusing that you can't see. You can't unsee.